Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. In my previous video, I talked about Sappho's expressions of sexuality and her discussion of personal life. I shared many of Mary Barnard's poetic translations of Sappho in that video, but there are many other interesting translation choices available. Just a warning, this is going to be kind of a nerdy discussion, so please feel free to skip it if you're not into the general issue of translating ancient poetry. In my last Sappho video, I mentioned that if you have any interest in general issues about translation, Sappho is a great author to explore. Check out several different versions of a translated work and compare them. If you have a good library, it won't take more than a few hours to go through a large number of very different translations of Sappho just to see how translation can affect how we read an author, what assumptions we make, and how we envision that author. Last time I quoted translator Carson, who said that reading Sappho is fundamentally an exercise in imagination. So today, let's look more closely at the great variety of translators out there. First, I want to focus on a few translations by authors who say they place an emphasis on being accurate. Afterwards, I'll look at a few translators that are more interested in creating poems which the translators consider accessible or fresh to modern readers. Carson's If Not Winter, Fragments of Sappho, is a fascinating version which emphasizes the fragmentary nature of what we have of Sappho. When I first saw Carson's book on the shelf, I was stunned. How on earth could there be a 400-page edition of Sappho fragments? Carson does not give us a long introduction, but in the few pages she offers, she gives a beautifully provocative statement. Even though you are approaching Sappho in translation, there's no reason you should miss the drama of trying to read a papyrus torn in half, or riddled with holes, or smaller than a postage stamp. Brackets imply a free space of imaginal adventure. Carson's volume presents each fragment of Sappho's poetry on one page, with a facing page in the original Greek. Most of the gaps and guesses are marked very clearly with space and brackets. Some of her translations are drop-dead gorgeous, but, at least to my light, sometimes the poetry gets interrupted with Carson's efforts to be faithful to the text we have, rather than trying to share the feel of the poems as they might have been felt at the time. If you're interested in approaching the text as an historian, or as a detective, or even as a poet, you might find this translation to be perfect. Personally, I found Carson's interpretation absolutely fascinating, and her language stunningly gorgeous in places, but I'm actually pretty glad I had seen Barnard's translation first. Side note, when I first read the Carson translation, a friend of mine told me that he had never had a relationship with a piece of punctuation like he had just developed with the square bracket. There are times when Carson fragments seem almost too fragmentary to justify a 2-page spread. They become for naught, or sinful. At the same time, there's something absolutely wonderful about actually seeing almost everything extant from Sappho. Our understanding of her writing style builds with each fragment we read, and our ability to do the work of imaging, which Carson describes, becomes a terrific game. The title fragment is a great example of the suggested possibilities. For me, the phrase, if not winter, started resonating with the idea of unrequited love. Instead of the narrator basking in the joy and sunshine of returned affection, the world might turn dark and cold. But of course, you might imagine this fragment in a wholly different way. Okay, another translation. David Campbell's Greek lyric has a different style, almost an anti-poetic version. If you're interested in experiencing the emotional pleasure of Sappho's poetry, this is not the translation for you. But if you're interested in seeing behind the scenes and experiencing the intellectual puzzle that is the translator's art, and especially the complications a Sappho translator faces, this book is an incredible resource. See if you can find a copy in your library to glance through. An example of what Campbell presents: 58. Fleeing? Was bitten? You of many names? Give success to the mouth. A totally different kind of accuracy that translators seek to match is Sappho's poetic style. Paul Roche, in his The Love Songs of Sappho, acknowledges the difficulty of replicating the meter of the poet's Greek, because Greek and English have inherently different sounds and rhythms. Quote, confronted with the perennial challenge of transferring the perfection of one language to the perfection of another, he writes, I have done my best to get near not only to what Sappho said, but the way she said it. Trying to create in English the exact metrical patterns of Sappho's Greek lines would seem strained and strange. They work only in the Greek. When a poetry is stripped of its original music, says the translator, a completely new set of sounds and rhythms has to be found. Roche has emphasized the ancient poet's use of both tight form and deep richness by creating his translations with assonance, alliteration, and a loose rhyming pattern. Here's his version of one of the poems I quoted last time from a different translator. I more than envy him. He is a god in my eyes, that man, given to sit in front of you, and close to himself sweetly to hear the sound of you speaking. Your magical laughter, this I swear, batters my heart, my breast to stir. My voice, when I see you suddenly near, refuses to come. My tongue breaks up, and delicate fire runs through my flesh. I see not a thing with my eyes, and all that I hear in my ears is a hum. The sweat runs down. A shuddering takes me in every part, and pale as the drying grasses. Then I think I am near the moment of dying. All right, yet another translator, Stanley Lombardo. Having very much enjoyed his translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey, I was very eager to see how Lombardo would treat Sappho. Similar to Mary Barnard, who I quoted a lot in my previous video, Lombardo makes Sappho's fragments read like poetry. But similar to Carson, he is more forthcoming about the limits of the text we have extant. He also tries to be reflective of the original rhythmic phrases. And on top of that combination of strengths, his version also includes a wonderful critical introduction by Pamela Gordon, my favorite quote from the intro. An extensive bibliography seldom satisfies a longing to speak with the dead. Lombardo's recreated poems are both sharp and fragile, almost brittle even in their luminosity. Using language like quenched desire or trembling and climax, he seems to get at the intense physicality of Sappho's poems about love, without treading into too modern wording. One of his translations of a Sappho fragment leaves me breathless as a crafter. Earth embroidered with flowers. Another translation of Sappho's work is Willis Barnstone's Sweet Bitter Love, Poems of Sappho. He has a newer paperback edition called The Complete Poems of Sappho, which I assume is the same translation. Barnstone's volume begins with an excellent introduction, placing Sappho in historical and literary context. His poems attempt to be true to the originals, but Barnstone is not nearly as concerned with producing a literal translation as some of the other translators I've mentioned. He cares more about allowing Sappho to speak with a voice that can be heard now, with at least some of the power it had in the ancient world. Quote, I go partway in reflecting the abused Greek text, he says, but typically he limits the mirror so the English can live. I love how Barnstone shapes puns in English that try to reflect some of the depth of the Greek. For example, Here's the translator's versions of words with virginity, and I'll try not to blush. Virginity, virginity, where have you gone, leaving me abandoned? No longer will I come to you. No longer will I come. Barnstone states his hope that more time spent in the library sifting through papyrus fragments and more technological advances, such as the use of infrared technology to reveal text, might possibly turn up more Sappho as the years progress. What a gift, and how ironic that it's through the most modern of means that we might approach the ancient. In my reading of these various translations of Sappho, I've been struck by the difference in not just translations of the poem, but in the introductions. One especially comprehensive commentary can be found in Aaron Poochigian's Stung with Love, Poems and Fragments. The introductory essay is very strong in its discussion of the historical context in which Sappho wrote, as well as in its analysis of the history of Sappho interpretation. In addition to the strong introduction, Poochigian provides specific commentary on each poem, significantly more detailed than in any other edition I looked at. In most translations, the footnotes are about translation issues or are explanations of little-known references. Here, however, we get full literary analysis, and the analysis is set on facing pages, in what I think of as Shakespeare style. Did you grow up with those paperback editions with notes on the even pages? Although I love the volume's introduction and its notes, honestly, I'm not bowled over by the actual translations. As I reviewed all these translations, I grew to love the elusive and incomplete echoes in Sappho's poems. This translator, on the other hand, wants to heal the riffs. Quote, I confess that though Sappho's remains are usually fragments that are themselves fragmentary, he writes, I've done my best to create a sense of completeness. As he says, he wanted his poems to be real poems in their own right. In his efforts to emphasize the fact that Sappho did not write in free verse, the translator rejects using free verse translation. Although the forms Sappho used do not convey into English, as I talked about earlier, the translator still wants to use a form that emphasizes the fact that Sappho's poems were actually songs. He therefore uses rhyming English lyric poetry. Sweet mother, I can't take shuttle in hand, there is a boy, and lust has crushed my spirit, just as gentle Aphrodite planned. Personally, I find this use of rhyme heavy and clunky, not at all consistent with the almost ethereal echoes I've come to love in the more open translations of Sappho's fragments. Here's another example, a part of one of Sappho's most famous verses. That fellow strikes me as God's double, couched with you face to face, delighting in your warm manner, your amiable talking and inviting laughter. The revelation flutters my ventricles, my sternum and stomach. The least glimpse and my lost voice stutters, refuses to come back. This version, at least to my ears, sounds very flat. But although I'm drawn to the open weave of translations that acknowledge the tatters, such as Carson's, I'm intrigued by the idea that what Sappho's original readers may have heard was much closer to the tightly bound songs presented by other translators, folks like Poochigian. What do you think? Where do you fall? Okay, one last translator. Sherod Santos's Greek lyric poetry is a fabulous collection of poems by a variety of ancient Greek poets. Early in Santos' book is a selection of Sappho poems. His translations are lyrical and ornate compared to some of the plain, direct versions of her work. Sometimes I find that more ornamented style to be effective with those little fragments that have survived from Sappho's originals. When we have very little remaining, it feels fairly comfortable to add a bit of decoration. But often, especially with the longer fragments, I'm put off and wish for the plainness and directness of the Sappho we've seen before. Here's a phrase from his translation. When you return from Crete, meet me at the apple grove, our little temple, its leafy altar incensed with the mineral scent of your soapy hair. The specificity of the line makes it seem intensely real and immediate, and the uses of senses other than sight and hearing makes the image feel lush. Even Santos' brief but thoughtful introduction is written in this lush style. One of my favorite sections explains how Sappho is the heir to what comes before. Quote, "To read Sappho is to gaze across the ever-widening gulf of history into the flickering lucidities of an interior life, a scattered dialogue of self and soul that seems to begin where Penelope, from the Odyssey, left off, in a brooding meditation on love and loss, the anguish of separation, the intense carnality of the loved one's presence, the rattled, nerve-end wait for love's return, all the keen desiderata of a heart ensconced dead center in the sway of at any given moment." It's astonishing to me how different these poems feel in these different translations. Pamela Gordon writes in her introduction to the Lombardo translation that one of the most rewarding ways to read Sappho is for us to read an individual fragment as though we were reading a note in a bottle. Quote, "Each fragment comes to us against the odds and across the centuries, and none arrives with any original instructions about context or meaning. All we know is that the sender is Sappho, though occasionally we're not even sure of that, and some of us are certain that we are the right recipient. I am sure the latter is true for me." Thanks for joining me for this nerdy video today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.